For a long time, this story existed only as background noise, a low hum that people sensed but could not quite place. It showed up in passing comments, odd timelines, and moments that did not fully connect. Nothing dramatic on its own, nothing that demanded attention. But when enough small details sit side by side, they begin to form a shape, and once that shape appears, it becomes hard to ignore. Over the past several weeks, that shape has started to sharpen, not because of a single announcement or a confirmed revelation, but because of a series of quiet shifts. Conversations that were once private began appearing in fragments. Familiar figures changed their behavior. People who usually spoke freely went silent. Others, who had stayed quiet for years, suddenly seemed less careful. This is not the kind of story that arrives with flashing alerts or official statements. There has been no press conference, no verified report confirming wrongdoing. What exists instead is something more subtle, and in some ways, more unsettling. A growing sense that a long-standing narrative may not be as solid as it once appeared. At the center of this discussion is a public figure whose image has been carefully managed for years. An image built on timing, chance meetings, and a story of sudden connection. It is a story many accepted because it felt simple, almost cinematic, two worlds colliding by accident, a modern fairy tale shaped for a modern audience. But recently, some online discussions have begun asking whether that story was ever accidental at all, whether the paths involved truly crossed for the first time when the public was told they did, or whether those paths had been running parallel unseen for much longer. What makes this moment different is not accusation, but context. Details that once seemed unrelated are now being placed next to each other. Travel dates, social circles, old associations that were never explained because no one thought to ask. According to public commentary, it is the alignment of these details, rather than any single claim, that has caused renewed attention. This is where the situation began to change, not because anyone proved anything, but because too many people started noticing the same inconsistencies at the same time. And once that happens, a story no longer fades on its own. It waits to be examined. To understand why these questions are being raised now, it helps to step back and look at the broader background. Not just at one person, but at the environment around them. The world they moved through before they became widely known. The kind of spaces where introductions happen quietly and relationships form without public notice. Long before the spotlight arrived, this individual worked in industries where visibility and invisibility often existed at the same time. Public-facing roles mixed with private networking. Social events blurred into professional opportunities. According to public commentary, this is common in certain elite circles, where people meet repeatedly without ever appearing together in official records. In those spaces, reputations are shaped less by headlines and more by access. Who gets invited back? Who is trusted? Who understands the unspoken rules? None of this is unusual on its own. Many people move through similar environments without anything controversial attached. The difference here is timing. Several years before the story most people know began, this individual's schedule appeared unusually flexible. There were gaps that were never fully explained, periods where projects paused, then resumed without clear reason. At the time, this raised little attention. Careers are unpredictable, opportunities come and go. But as observers now note, those gaps seem to line up with specific locations and social hubs, places known less for public events and more for private gatherings. This does not prove anything. It does, however, raise reasonable questions about how connections may have formed earlier than previously understood. At the same time, there were figures operating behind the scenes who were known for facilitating introductions. Not matchmakers in the romantic sense, but connectors. People who understood how to bring the right personalities into the same room. These individuals rarely appear in official stories, yet their influence is often significant. According to some online discussions, the presence of these intermediaries may help explain how someone could move between circles without leaving obvious traces. Invitations handled verbally, travel arranged quietly, meetings framed as casual or professional rather than personal. This context matters because it challenges the simplicity of the public narrative. The original story relied heavily on the idea of coincidence, two lives intersecting unexpectedly, but coincidence becomes harder to accept when multiple paths appear to converge long before the supposed starting point. This is not about claiming deception. No formal statement has confirmed that the public story is false, but it is about acknowledging that the version most people heard was incomplete, and incomplete stories tend to invite speculation once missing pieces begin to surface. Another factor contributing to renewed interest is the behavior of institutions involved. Large organizations, especially traditional ones, tend to operate slowly and quietly. When something makes them uncomfortable, they rarely respond directly. Instead, they create distance. In recent months, that distance has become noticeable. Events once attended without issue were skipped. Invitations appeared to cool. Interactions that were once warm became formal. According to observers, these shifts suggest internal caution rather than external conflict. This is where interpretation becomes difficult. Institutions do not explain their thinking publicly. They adjust behind closed doors. To outsiders, the changes feel sudden. To insiders, they may have been building for years. What followed only added to the confusion. Media coverage began changing in tone, not openly critical but more careful. Stories focused less on celebration and more on process. More how and why questions appeared, even if they were phrased gently. At the same time, the individual at the center of the story appeared to reduce their visibility. Public appearances slowed. Personal updates became less frequent. This, too, does not confirm anything. People step back for many reasons. But in the context of growing questions, silence takes on meaning, especially when that silence replaces a previously active media presence. This background helps explain why the discussion has not faded. It is not driven by a single rumor or a dramatic leak. It is driven by accumulation, small, reasonable observations layered over time. And as more people begin looking backward instead of forward, they are no longer asking what might happen next. They are asking what might have already happened, unnoticed, years ago. At this point, many people started asking quieter questions, not the kind meant for headlines, but the kind that circulate in private conversations. Questions about timing, about familiarity, about whether certain reactions made sense if everything had truly unfolded the way it was presented. One of the first things observers noticed was comfort. When the relationship became public, there was very little visible adjustment period. According to public commentary, most people entering unfamiliar institutions show hesitation. They make mistakes, they appear cautious. Here, the transition seemed smooth almost immediately. That smoothness was initially praised. It was framed as confidence, as adaptability. But as discussions deepened, some began wondering whether that ease came from experience rather than instinct, whether certain customs, settings, and expectations were already familiar long before the public introduction. This question alone would mean very little without other details, but it did not exist in isolation. People began revisiting old photographs, event listings, and travel records that had been publicly available for years but never examined closely, not because anyone expected to find something, but because curiosity had been triggered. According to online discussions, patterns started to emerge, the same locations appearing repeatedly, the same circles overlapping in subtle ways. Again, none of this proves prior involvement. Social worlds often intersect, but repeated intersections can suggest more than coincidence. Another area of focus became narrative consistency. Over time, the story of how everything began had been told more than once. Small differences appeared, nothing dramatic, a date described slightly differently, an introduction framed with different emphasis, individually harmless but collectively noticeable. In news-style analysis, this is often where stories shift, not when facts change, but when memory becomes flexible. It raises the question of why a story would need to be adjusted at all if it were simple and fixed. Some commentators suggested that the adjustments were meant to protect privacy. Others argued they reflected evolving perspective. Both explanations are reasonable, yet neither fully explains why earlier versions disappeared from public record rather than being clarified. As this discussion grew, attention turned to the people around the central figure. Friends, acquaintances, and professional contacts who had been present during earlier years. Many of them remained silent. A few, however, appeared to distance themselves quietly. No one made public accusations. No one released definitive statements, but there were unfollows, absences, and subtle changes in tone. In environments where reputation matters, these small signals are often read carefully. This is where the situation became more complex, because what was unfolding was not a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no documents presented as proof, no verified recordings. Instead, there was an erosion of certainty. The public was no longer being asked to believe something new. They were being invited, indirectly, to reconsider something old. This reconsideration extended to motivations. If the original story was incomplete, why present it that way? According to some analysis, simplified narratives serve a purpose. They make stories easier to accept. They remove ambiguity. Ambiguity, however, is often closer to reality. especially in environments shaped by status, power, and careful image management. What followed was an increase in speculative framing, though most responsible commentary remained cautious. Phrases like unconfirmed and according to observers became common. This reflected an understanding that without direct evidence, the discussion must remain analytical rather than declarative. Still, the questions persisted, not because anyone wanted to dismantle a public figure, but because the gaps were no longer invisible. This is also when institutional silence began to stand out more sharply. Requests for clarification were met with generic responses. No timelines were corrected, no background was added. The story remained as it was, despite growing interest in its origins. In media analysis, silence can mean many things. It can mean confidence, it can mean strategy, it can also mean uncertainty about what can safely be said. As weeks passed, the tone of discussion shifted again. Less curiosity, more concern. Not concern about wrongdoing, but concern about transparency. People were not asking for scandal, they were asking for clarity, and clarity was not coming. This is where tension quietly entered the story, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that settles in, the feeling that something important had been left unexplained, and that the longer it remained unexplained, the harder it would be to address. And as that tension grew, so did the sense that this story was no longer about the present. It was about the past, and whether the past could continue to stay unexamined. This is where the pattern began to feel harder to dismiss, not because of any single claim, but because the same type of uncertainty kept appearing in different places. Each time someone tried to map the story in a straight line, they found themselves looping back to the same unanswered points. Observers began noting how often certain names surfaced on the edges of the narrative, not as central figures, but as recurring presences, people connected to events, locations, or introductions who were never fully explained. In serious analysis, repetition like that matters. It suggests structure rather than randomness. At the same time, attention turned to how quickly trust had formed within powerful circles. According to public commentary, institutions built on tradition tend to move slowly. They test people. They observe quietly before granting access. Yet here, access seemed to come with remarkable speed. That speed was once described as refreshing, a sign of modern openness. But in retrospect, some analysts began asking whether the doors opened so easily because they had already been unlocked. This is not a claim of manipulation. No official source has confirmed that prior familiarity existed, but when patterns repeat, responsible discussion must acknowledge them. Another shift occurred in how past events were referenced. Situations that once seemed insignificant were suddenly framed as formative. Casual encounters became meaningful turning points. Again, this does not imply dishonesty. Memory often reorganizes itself around outcomes. Still, the revisions raised quiet concerns. In long-form reporting, changes in emphasis often signal an attempt to strengthen a narrative rather than simply recall it. As the discussion deepened, some media outlets began revisiting archived material, old interviews, early profiles, background pieces written before public perception had fully settled. These sources often contain details later omitted because they no longer fit the dominant story. According to analysts, these early records revealed a more complex picture, one marked by ambition, careful networking, and an understanding of how visibility works. None of this is inherently negative. Many public figures share similar traits. The question was not whether ambition existed, but how early it began shaping outcomes. This is where unease started spreading among longtime observers, because ambition paired with access can create situations where lines blur, where personal and professional interests overlap in ways that are difficult to separate later. What followed only intensified that unease. Certain defensive responses appeared preemptively. Critics were framed broadly rather than addressed specifically. Questions were interpreted as attacks. This defensive posture suggested sensitivity around the subject of origins. In media behavior analysis, defensiveness often signals perceived vulnerability, not necessarily guilt, but awareness that the foundation of a story may not withstand scrutiny. Meanwhile, institutional responses remained minimal. No clarifications were offered, no additional background provided. This absence created a vacuum, and vacuums are rarely left empty for long. As speculation filled that space, more people began connecting dots independently, not in coordinated efforts, but through shared observation. This organic spread made the discussion harder to contain because it was not driven by a single source. This is why the tension continued to rise, not through explosive revelations, but through slow accumulation, each unanswered question adding weight. And by this stage, the discussion had moved beyond curiosity. It had become about credibility, about whether public trust could survive unanswered inconsistencies. This is often the most dangerous moment for any long-standing narrative, not when it is attacked, but when it is quietly reevaluated by people who once accepted it without question. From here, the story no longer belonged to any individual. It belonged to the pattern itself, and patterns, once recognized, rarely disappear. As these patterns became harder to ignore, the wider response began to shift in noticeable ways. Not all at once and not dramatically, but steadily. Public conversation did not explode. It cooled, slowed, and grew more deliberate. People were no longer reacting emotionally. They were observing. In online spaces where this story had once been treated as entertainment or personality-driven commentary, the tone changed. According to public discussion, many people stopped debating character and started debating structure. They focused less on who someone was and more on how events unfolded. This shift matters because it reflects a move from opinion to analysis. Traditional media outlets responded cautiously. There were no bold headlines declaring wrongdoing. Instead, coverage leaned into context. Long-form pieces revisited timelines. Language became careful. Words like reportedly, previously stated, and has not been independently confirmed appeared more frequently. This signaled restraint but also awareness. Some journalists framed the situation as a case study in modern image building, how stories are shaped, how public narratives can harden quickly, then resist revision even when new questions arise. This framing allowed discussion without making direct claims. At the same time, certain outlets chose not to engage at all. They continued covering present-day developments while avoiding deeper background. According to media analysts, this split is common when information feels incomplete. Some organizations wait, others probe gently, few rush forward. Public institutions involved in the story remained largely silent. No extended explanations were offered. No timelines were formally clarified. This silence was interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as confidence, others saw it as risk management. Institutions, especially those tied to tradition and continuity, tend to avoid reopening settled narratives. Doing so can create instability. Even acknowledging questions can give them weight, so silence becomes a tool, not necessarily an admission. However, silence also has consequences. It leaves interpretation to others, and in this case, interpretation continued to spread. Public figures adjacent to the story adjusted their behavior. Appearances became more controlled. Language grew more formal. According to observers, this suggested a desire to avoid being pulled into a conversation that no one could clearly define. There were also signs of internal recalibration. Partnerships that once felt enthusiastic became transactional. Support that had been visible moved behind the scenes. None of this was announced. It was inferred through absence. The public reacted in a similarly measured way. There was no mass backlash, no coordinated response. Instead, there was a gradual withdrawal of certainty. Polling data referenced by commentators suggested declining confidence rather than rising anger. This distinction is important. Confidence erodes quietly. It does not shout, it hesitates. And once hesitation sets in, narratives lose their momentum. Social platforms reflected this shift. Posts celebrating milestones received less engagement. Critical posts did not necessarily receive more. Instead, engagement overall softened. People watched rather than reacted. In communication analysis, this often signals fatigue. Not outrage fatigue, but story fatigue. When an audience feels something unresolved is being repeated without progress, attention fades. Yet the discussion did not disappear. It moved to smaller, more analytical spaces. Forums, long-form videos, written commentary, places where people are willing to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it quickly. Institutions also appeared to take notice of this quieter shift. According to public commentary, messaging strategies adjusted. Emphasis moved away from origin stories and toward present initiatives. The past was neither defended nor expanded upon. This redirection suggested an attempt to stabilize the narrative without reopening it. Focus forward, avoid backward. But avoiding the past does not erase it, especially when the past is what people are questioning. Some commentators pointed out that institutional caution may have been justified. Without verified evidence, there is little to respond to. Addressing speculation can amplify it. In that sense, restraint is rational. Others argued that transparency, even partial, might have prevented the spread of uncertainty. Acknowledging complexity does not require admitting fault. It requires trust in the audience's ability to understand nuance. This debate itself became part of the story, not about what happened, but about how stories are managed when certainty cracks. What followed was a stalemate. No new information emerged. No formal statements resolved the questions, but the questions remained active, sustained by the very absence of answers. This is why the situation did not escalate into scandal, yet did not fade into irrelevance. It existed in between, a liminal space where nothing was confirmed, but nothing felt settled. For institutions, this is an uncomfortable place. It offers no clear action. For the public, it invites continued observation. And this is why the story continued circulating, not because it was sensational, but because it was unfinished. People sensed that they were seeing only part of a larger picture, and they were unsure whether the remaining parts would ever be shown. In media history, these are the stories that linger longest, not the ones that explode, but the ones that quietly refuse to close. This is why the discussion has not disappeared, even as attention has shifted elsewhere. Stories built on uncertainty do not resolve on their own. They pause, they wait, and every so often, something small brings them back into focus. In this case, what keeps the story alive is not new information, but unresolved alignment. The same unanswered questions continue to surface because they sit at the foundation of everything that followed. If the beginning is unclear, the rest of the story feels unstable. According to long-form commentators, this is especially true when public identity is involved. When a figure's role, purpose, or moral authority is tied to a carefully constructed origin story, any doubt about that origin affects how later actions are interpreted. Even neutral actions begin to feel performative rather than organic. This does not mean the public has turned against the individual involved. Many have not. Instead, what has changed is the lens. Support and criticism now coexist with skepticism. People are slower to accept explanations at face value. They listen for what is said and what is not said. Another reason the story continues is its symbolic weight. It is no longer just about one person. It has become a reference point for broader conversations about power, access, and narrative control, about how modern reputations are built and protected. In that sense, the story functions almost like a mirror. Different audiences see different concerns reflected back at them. Some see ambition, others see institutional rigidity, some see media failure, others see public overreach. Because the story sits at the intersection of these themes, it remains relevant even without updates. It gets referenced indirectly, alluded to, used as context for other discussions. This is also why definitive conclusions remain elusive. Without verified documentation or formal statements, analysis must remain cautious. Responsible voices continue to emphasize that no wrongdoing has been proven, that speculation is not evidence. And yet, speculation persists because it fills a gap left by silence. This dynamic creates a strange balance. On one side, restraint, on the other, curiosity, neither fully overpowering the other. Observers note that time may ultimately be the deciding factor. As years pass, memories fade, new narratives emerge, or sometimes someone chooses to speak. But time can also harden questions. What is not explained early becomes harder to explain later. Context is lost. Intent is misread. Silence gains meaning it may never have had. For now, the story exists in a holding pattern. It is not advancing, but it is not retreating either. It remains available, ready to be re-examined whenever conditions change. This is often how long-form documentary stories end up being told, not because they reached a dramatic conclusion, but because they never fully concluded at all. And that brings us to the present moment, a moment defined less by revelation and more by reflection. People are no longer asking what happened yesterday. They are asking what they might have misunderstood years ago. That shift from reaction to reconsideration is subtle but powerful. It does not demand immediate answers. It simply keeps the questions alive. Whether those questions will ever be answered remains unclear. What is clear is that the story has already changed, not in facts but in perception. And in public life, perception often shapes reality more enduringly than any single confirmed detail. In the end, this story may never deliver the kind of resolution many people expect. There may be no final statement that ties everything together, no moment where uncertainty gives way to clarity, and that, in itself, may be the point. What has unfolded here is not a revelation, but a process, a slow reassessment of a narrative that once felt settled. It reminds us that public stories are often simplified versions of more complex realities. They are shaped by timing, access, and what people are ready to hear. This discussion has remained careful for a reason. Without confirmed evidence, it cannot and should not move beyond analysis. Responsible voices continue to stress that questions are not conclusions, that curiosity is not accusation. Still, it is fair to acknowledge how fragile trust can be when stories feel incomplete. When gaps appear, people fill them with interpretation, sometimes generously, sometimes skeptically, rarely neutrally. For the individual at the center of this story, the challenge going forward may not be rebuttal, but transparency, not to prove innocence, but to rebuild confidence. Confidence that the story people were told was not designed to obscure more than it revealed. For institutions involved, the lesson may be similar. Silence can protect in the short term, but it can also allow uncertainty to settle in deeper ways. Choosing when and how to speak is always a risk. Choosing never to speak is also a choice, with consequences of its own. For the public, this story serves as a reminder to remain patient, to resist rushing to judgment, to understand that not every unresolved question hides a hidden truth. Some simply reflect the limits of what we can know. At the same time, patience does not require passivity. It allows space for reflection, for revisiting assumptions, for holding narratives lightly rather than tightly. This is where the story rests for now, not concluded, not collapsed, simply observed. It may resurface in the future, or it may slowly fade as new stories take its place. Either outcome is possible. What matters is how it has already shaped perception. In the quiet aftermath, what remains is a collective pause, a moment where certainty has softened and curiosity has taken its place, not to accuse, not to defend, but to consider. And sometimes, in public life, that moment of consideration is the most honest ending a story can have.